Hey guys. So another question that I get quite often is what does a software engineer's career typically look like? And what are the different career options for somebody who goes into software engineering? So let's take a quick look at this diagram that I drew up. So here, as you can see, I've actually divided up the different positions that a software engineer can have into different categories. So each one of these individual rectangles indicates a position that a software engineer could have. And of course, some of these positions are not necessarily formal positions, such as all the way on the left here, where you can see entrepreneurship, freelancing. Of course, you're not an employee in those particular situations, but they do effectively represent the career position that a software engineer could have at any given time. So, for majority of folks getting into the world of software, your first taste of your software career is going to be found as a junior software engineer. So here, of course, SWE stands for software engineer. And I've left this software engineering rectangle here at the top of this diagram for a reason, because typically that's where most folks start off as. And this column here, starting from junior software engineer all the way down to distinguished, this is what I call the individual contributor column. So what does an individual contributor mean? So an individual contributor is, what you would consider a vanilla software engineer. So, your typical employee in the R&D department of whatever company you may be employed by. And typically an individual contributor has well-defined and bounded roles and responsibilities. And usually those roles and responsibilities involve coding, designing individual features or individual user stories, which for those of you who don't know is typically a smaller block of a feature that can be worked on by a software engineer. And of course, these individual contributors are divided based on their level of experience. So you start off as a junior software engineer. So after around a year or a year and a half of experience, you'll typically find yourself as a level 2 engineer, which typically doesn't really have a prefix. It's just referred to as a software engineer. And then from around 2 to 3 years of experience after reaching a level 2 position, you'll find yourself in a level 3 position, often known as a senior software engineer. So, of course, as you grow in experience and as your level increases in the individual contributor route, that typically involves an increased number of responsibilities, an increased range of roles that you may take on as part of your job. And that pattern typically continues until you reach the maximum level that you can get to as an individual contributor. So after around maybe like 5 years of additional experience, you would reach the principal software engineer position or a level 4. And then lastly, once you've really distinguished yourself, and of course the requirements for this are different based on the company that you're working for, you would reach the final distinguished software engineering position. And of course, the naming here can vary based on your company. Some companies use just plain numbers like level 1, level 2. And some companies use these fancy little prefixes like senior engineer, principal engineer, distinguished. Some refer to this as a senior principal software engineer. And overall, the individual contributor route is pretty straightforward. It's what you would expect of a software engineer, just gaining experience and gaining competence over the years. Now, if a principal software engineer or someone with around the same level of competence wants to get more into the designing aspect of software, which involves converting business requirements into technical requirements and designing the frameworks and architecture of software systems, designing the data layer in the sense that you choose what data layer decisions you would make, such as what kind of database should I use, what kind of backend framework should I use, what kind of front end framework should I use, what supplemental services should I integrate into my software. Decisions like that typically fall under the responsibility of a software architect. So a lot of folks decide that, I'm actually going to take on a fewer coding responsibilities, and I'm actually willing to take on more design responsibilities. So these folks will actually transition from being an individual contributor into becoming a software architect. And of course, as a software architect, you'll find yourself more involved with upper management. You find yourself involved in more business requirements. And you also find yourself far less involved with actual coding. But of course, needless to say, a software architect typically has a much higher salary as their role is typically more involved and has more expectations towards it. And as a software architect, you would typically expect a salary that is around the same amount that a distinguished software engineer would make, or perhaps even a little bit more. Okay, so let's get into some of the peripheral career paths that you can take as a software engineer. So, of course, most people start off as an individual contributor when they don't have a lot of experience. And that, of course, typically means that you would take on a junior level position when you start off in your software career. But a lot of folks actually realize that, you know what, I'm more of a people person and I'm more people oriented as opposed to task oriented. So for those folks, what a typical career path would look like is that they would start off as a junior engineer, they would get up to around senior level. And then once the opportunity arises, they would actually transition into management. So this is where this column comes in. So this is what I refer to as the management track. So of course, in management, you wouldn't really touch the code. And most of your day-to-day tasks are non-technical in nature. Your job typically entails more people-oriented tasks, such as managing employees, making decisions of what business priorities the team should take on, etc. And of course, not to mention handling people's compensation. So once an engineer transitions into the management role, they'll typically start off as an engineering manager. So of course, this has many different titles, but typically an engineering manager is quite familiar with the technical kind of aspects of software and usually is responsible for maybe around one or two teams of engineers. So once the engineering manager grows in experience and the opportunity arises, they would find themselves in a senior manager position. And of course, the higher up you get in management, the more teams you'll find yourself responsible for. So if an engineering manager is responsible for one or two teams, perhaps a senior manager is responsible for a few batches of teams. Perhaps a VP would find themselves responsible for an entire portfolio of the company. And directors, and of course the CTO, would find themselves responsible for almost or even the entire R&D department of a given company. The thing is with the management route is that opportunities to climb the ladder are typically fewer and more far in between. And the reason for this is that you would actually have to find opportunities to increase your job title. And usually this involves an upper level manager stepping down from their position or otherwise. But of course, it is quite well known that managers will typically earn more than engineers. So I would say an engineering manager would typically find themselves making more than a senior engineer. A senior manager would be making more than a principal. A VP would be making more than a distinguished. And of course, directors and CTOs are making the big bucks. And that right there is the management route. Another path that software engineers could take is specializing. And what do I mean by specializing? What I mean is a specialization of one particular area of the software. And usually this falls into three categories: performance, security, and localization/accessibility. So these three roles here, I would say, are supplemental to the engineering teams you would typically find in a software company. So these guys are the supporting engineers. So let's say, for instance, you have a team of engineers working on a particular product for a company. And let's say they had a question related to software or security, or they're looking for best practices, or they need some kind of supplemental resources having to do with security or performance. That's where these supplemental engineers would come in. So a security engineer, of course, would specialize in security and would be responsible for providing resources for the engineering teams in the world of on the topic of security. And then similarly, a performance engineer would do the same, but for performance. And then lastly, localization/accessibility engineer would do the same, but for front end translation and accessibility related features of the user interface of your software. Now, I call these supplemental engineers because they typically don't follow the usual route of individual contributor. An individual contributor would typically work on kind of the core deliverables that directly relate to the business priorities and to the business requirements. But these supporting engineers typically find themselves in more supporting roles where they don't directly work on delivering business requirements, but instead they work on supporting the engineering teams to deliver business requirements in a robust fashion. All right, so as far as a software engineer as an employee, that's typically what you would expect to find in the industry. But of course, there's a couple more options for you if you want to go outside the realm of being an employee. So in particular, I'm referring to this last column on the left here, which I refer to as the miscellaneous category. Again, in these roles, you wouldn't really consider yourself an employee per se. Entrepreneurship here typically refers to those folks who want to found a startup where they have enough technical skills to start working on a proof of concept of their business application. And most of the technical work that they'll be putting in their career will typically be in the very start when their startup is still small in scale. And of course, eventually, once the startup takes off, then they'll fall into more of a executive role in the business. Freelancing is a bit different where you are self-employed, but you're still doing the work of an individual contributor in the sense that you're working on code and a lot of your daily tasks are technical in nature, but you're not employed by any particular company. So this typically involves doing contractual work with different companies or different entities. So let's say you agree on a contract to deliver a particular feature with a given deadline. And then once the task is completed, you would get paid the agreed upon amount. And of course, a freelancer can take on multiple contracts of this nature. So, of course, the advantage of being a freelancer is that you're not tied to any particular set of business hours. But of course, the downside is that you would find yourself having to go out and actually look for work. Not to mention the fact that you're also going to be doing a lot of the overhead tasks that you have to be responsible for, such as bookkeeping, marketing for yourself, etc. And then this last category here with software consulting, this one's very similar to entrepreneurship, but typically it comes after a decently established career as an individual contributor, where they either join an existing software consultancy or they found their own consultancy. So you'll see this position is a bit of a mix between a technical engineering position and an entrepreneurship position. For folks who join a software consulting company, they would find themselves as an employee once again. But of course, for folks who end up starting their own consulting company, they'll find themselves in an entrepreneurial type position. And there you have it. This is typically what you would find in the industry. And of course, this list is not all inclusive. So perhaps there may be other kind of roles that people have taken on. But I would say I think this is a very comprehensive look as to what a career in the world of software would look like. Thanks for watching.